So again, welcome everybody. I'm trying to speak both to our audience online and to those colleagues and friends who showed up in person. Today's talk is going to be about nation building and history, the application of the Beneš decrees, and the principle of collective guilt in the 21st century. If you go to the National Archives and Records Administration on Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C., you see an inscription. And the inscription says, past is followed, past is followed. The present is explained by the past. And so it is with the current talk, which is about the ghosts of history, the ghosts of history in Central Europe, of which there are many. This particular ghost, the existence of this particular ghost goes back to the treaties of Paris, which concluded the First World War in 1919 and 1920, in particular, the peace treaties of Trianon that defined Hungary's post-World War I borders, and many of the current much of the current acrimony and issues in Central European politics go back to that peace treaty, which left large bodies of national minorities in countries that did not want them, in countries where they did not wish to live, and in which countries their existence is still somewhat ambiguous. In hoc signo, I will give the word to Professor Balázs Tárnok, who was born and raised in Slovakia, attended high school in the town of Komárno. He earned his PhD in Pázmány Péter Catholic University in Hungary in European law. He is currently a professor at the European Strategy Research Institute at the University of Public Service, and currently he is a visiting research fellow at the Kellogg Institute at the University of Notre Dame. So Professor Tárnok will give his talk, and then we'll all have chances to comment and or ask questions. Professor Tárnok, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for this honor. Thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure to give you this presentation on this topic, which is quite close to my heart and my academic field of interest as well. As Professor Borio already introduced, the topic is going to be about the Beneš decrees, and I'll put special emphasis on the current daily application of these decrees in Slovakia. First, I'd like to give you a short introduction to the historical background, to the development of these decrees, and then I'll lead the presentation up to the legal part, that how is it possible that in the 21st century, in the European Union member states, these decrees are still applied. And finally, in the final part of the presentation, I'll try to give to show the relevance of these cases, the political context, and put it on some recommendations as well. As Professor Bori already mentioned, the whole situation we are talking here about is the consequence of the post-World War I treaties. The Austro-Hungarian monarchy was a multi-ethnic country, and as you can see on the map on the right. And after it fell apart as the direct consequence of these treaties, the first Czechoslovak Republic, which was created accordingly, was multi-ethnic as well. As you can see on the map, there was a significant number of German minority at the border of today's the Czech Republic, and a significant Hungarian minority in the southern part of today's Slovakia. At that time, only 50% of the first Czechoslovak Republic's population was Czech. Slovak was 16%, while German was 23%, and Hungarian approximately 5%. Therefore, we can speak about these border minorities, which appeared to be there, and this character to be a multi-ethnic country with border minorities pretty much determined the Czechoslovakia's role in World War II accordingly. In 1938, under the Munich Agreement, the Sudetenland part of Czechoslovakia was seized to Germany, while under the first Vienna arbitration, ethnic Hungarian territories in the south, Slovakia were going to Hungary, as you can see that on the map as well. Later that, the first Czechoslovak Republic in 1939 fell apart. In March, the first Slovak Republic, partially recognized client state of the Nazi Germany led by Joseph Tiso, declared its independence, and parallelly the German troops invaded the Sudetenland, and the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia was created. After these events, the President of the Czechoslovak Republic, Eduard Beneš, and other Czechoslovak politicians decided to emigrate to France at first, where they created the Czechoslovak National Committee, and then later that, after France fell, they moved to London, where the Provisional State Administration was created and eventually recognized by Great Britain in mid-July 1940 as well, and later by the United States as well. So there was a interim Czechoslovak government created in London and functioning there in London. And it is also worth to note that in 1943, Stalin met Beneš in Moscow, which was a crucial meeting for the Czechoslovak leadership, because besides signing the Czechoslovak-Soviet Union Treaty of Friendship and Mutual Collaboration, Beneš was trying to gain support of Stalin for his later agenda, which was followed by the World War resettlement. And this agenda was coming from the fact that after the war, the Second World War, the Czechoslovak government wanted to punish Jews who participated in the destruction of the Czechoslovak Republic. And Beneš generally and other politicians, Czechoslovak politicians, blamed the national minorities, Hungarians and Germans, for this falling apart. And thus, some historians even say that the World War II was not really the cause, but an excuse for the decrees to implement these politics, because in the first Czechoslovak Republic, the minority fate was lost. Basically, the minority policy of the first Czechoslovak Republic failed. They failed to make the minorities feel as Czechoslovakia was their home. So basically, they gave up on this possibility of developing a fair minority system, and therefore another solution was put forward or created to create a clean national Slavic nation state. Generally, about the decrees from a legal point of view, the aim of these decrees, which were issued between 1940 and 1945, to prepare the post-war new state's interior structure. How were these decrees adopted and created? The very first decree was issued only by Beneš, which basically established the new government, the government in exile. And the later decrees were proposed by this government in exile, prepared and discussed by the cabinet, and then discussed by the State Council, which was an advisory body of the President of the Republic, and eventually issued by President Beneš. It is also worth to note that after April 4th, 1945, when the Czechoslovak eastern part of the Czechoslovak Republic was already liberated by the Red Army, and the Slovak National Council was functioning, they also adopted decisions, and these decisions of the Slovak National Council and the decrees of the President shall be interpreted together. The decrees were adopted, as I said, from 21st of July 1940, when the Great Britain acknowledged the interim Czechoslovak government, until 28th of October 1945, when the permanent new government of Czechoslovakia was created, even though on the 4th of April in Košice, Kassa, in Eastern Slovakia, they declared the new government program in the partly liberated Czechoslovakia. President Beneš was keep going with issuing these decrees. So all in total, 141 decrees being issued. Out of that, 43 in London in the emigration, and 98 of them back in Czechoslovakia between April 4th and October 28th of 1945. It is also important to note that in political history and political theory, rather, the term Beneš decrees refers to those documents, specifically the decisions of the Slovak National Council and the decrees of the president, which do concern the status of ethnic Hungarians and Germans and do apply the principle of collective guilt. 13 decrees out of the 141 was based on this principle. And when the publicists, the politicians talk about Beneš decrees, primarily they mean these decrees based on the principle of collective guilt. In terms of the sanctions, what were applied against Germans and Hungarians after World War II, we have to distinguish between sanctions based on individual criminal responsibility and collective responsibility. In terms of the first one, basically the Czechoslovak authorities convicted the perpetrators of war crimes based on special court proceedings, so their individual criminal responsibility was identified in an individual court proceeding. The other one is the more problematic one, because Czechoslovakia generally claimed the responsibility of individuals based on solely on the fact that they were belonging to the Hungarian or German ethnicity or gained that citizenship, although these people, normally ordinary people, did not have any individual responsibility. The fundamental premise was that every Hungarian and German is responsible, if not even guilty, pretty much responsible, unless proved otherwise. But in practice, that was like mission impossible. It was very hard to do that. And they were punished accordingly with the loss of their citizenship. Those who had taken the German or Hungarian citizenship, they were deprived of their citizenship. However, it was not obvious that their own decision, because the borders were changing. So when the borders were changing and these people became, for instance, Hungarian citizens, nobody asked them if they want to be Hungarian citizens or not. On the other hand, there were the confiscations of the private properties and deportation on forced labor. These three main sanctions I would like to talk about. First of all, we gotta talk about the expulsion of the German population, because this is the part where the fate of the German and the Hungarian ethnic community departs, gets on a different way, because the expulsion of the German population was actually approved by the great powers on the Potsdam Conference, while the unilateral deportation of Hungarian population was not. Actually, the expulsion of the German population was a huge ethnic cleansing project, including 14 million Germans all around Central and Eastern Europe. And of course, if you want to read further on this, I can recommend Professor Waller's paper on the Sudetenland and Germans situation. To sum it up, basically the decision to expose the German population was adopted by the government in exile. However, the agreement on this, the international agreement, was reached only in August 1945 at the Potsdam Conference. Yet, between May 1945 and August 1945, the so-called wild expulsions happened in Czechoslovakia, deporting the German population. Eduard Benes in October called for the final solution of the German question. Konečné řešení německé otázky, as he said, that meant that the full and complete expulsion of the German population from Czechia. In course of this, several peasants died violently during this expulsion, and basically the deportation was almost completely finished by 1950. The fact supports this, that today, according to the 2011 census, only 0.2% of the population of the Czech Republic is German. As I said, the deportation, the unilateral deportation of Hungarians was a different story, because the great powers did not approve this unilateral deportation, partly due to the experiences of the cruelly implemented exclusion of the Germans. And even though the Soviet Union was putting a huge pressure on its allies in terms of proving the deportation of Hungarians as well, the American and the British widow basically saved the Hungarian population from this. It was not approved. However, in practice, at least partially, it was implemented. In February 1946, there was an exchange, an agreement on the exchange of inhabitants signed, because the Soviet Union was making huge pressure on the parties to sign this agreement. However, Hungary in the first months tried to delay the implementation of the agreement, trying to save all these ethnic Hungarians in South Slovakia. Obviously, Prague realized this and decided to force Budapest to implement the terms of the agreement. To this end, the Czechoslovak government started the deportation of Hungarians unilaterally to Czechia for a forced labor. From November 1946 to February 1947, more than 44,000 persons have been deported to Czechia, almost 12,000 families, and more than 5,000 children below the age of 6. The strategy worked, and accordingly, the exchange of population under the signed agreement was implemented from April 1947 to December 48. Somewhat 80,000 Hungarians have been transferred to Hungary. And what is quite significant from at least a Hungarian-Slovakian point of view, that those who were on the list, who were the wealthiest one and the intellectuals. So it was an international take to behead the Hungarian elite in Czechoslovakia, and it caused a tangible damage in our community. What can we feel even these days, that the elite was beheaded at that time. And it's even worth to note that Czechoslovakia at that time was under Soviet occupation power, which is more or less familiar with the expulsion of whole communities. And besides that, this 1943 meeting between Stalin and Benes was crucial, because at that time Stalin's support was gained for this unilateral deportation. The only way to avoid deportation and the confiscation of property was the project called Slovakization. It was based on the assumption that in fact there have never been Hungarians in South Slovakia. These are folks who used to be Slovaks, but they lost their Slovak identity. So now the Czechoslovak government gave the opportunity to them to re-Slovakize, to regain their Slovak identity. And those who re-Slovakized exempted themselves from the deportation and the confiscation of private property. More than 400,000 Hungarians applied for this, and almost 350,000 received their Slovakization certificate. That also meant that more than half of the Hungarian population in Slovakia refused to do that, even though that meant that it would face deportation, they would face the loss of their private property, So they rather decided to stay there and stay there as Hungarians. And the other sanction applied against Germans and Hungarians was the confiscation of private property under the decision of the Slovak National Council number 104 from 1945. Every Hungarian and German lost their private property, and it was implemented by individual decisions. But I will talk about this later. Just to sum up the historical part, the change came in 1948 with the communist takeover, but it was not the result of the communist ideology, but it had some geopolitical reasons. The Cold War just started, and Moscow didn't want any nationalistic tensions within the communist bloc, so they ordered the new Czechoslovak communist leadership to end the persecution, and as a result, deported people could return to their homes if they had any, because in most of the situations their homes have already been given to settlers from South Slovakia or exchange people from Hungary. They got back their citizenship, and the confiscation of property was suspended, even though the already confiscated properties were not given back. And generally, the restitution of property, which was confiscated under the Beneš decrees, were not solved even later. First of all, in 1948, the communist takeover came, and the relevance of the private property was getting irrelevant because of the collectivization on the one hand. Later that, after the democratic transition, the newly created democratic states provided the opportunity for restitution, but only in terms of those lands which have been confiscated after February 1948. That means that there have been no possibility to reclaim those lands which have been confiscated under the Beneš decrees. And thus the restitution was not solved. And here we arrive to the present, and the present relevance, which is the point of this presentation to show, because at least from a Slovak and Czech perspective, the decrees, the Beneš decrees, are considered as part of the history. Indeed, the decrees, and specifically the decrees which were based on this principle of collective guilt, have been formally repealed. And in theory, at least, they should have, they are supposed to not have any legal effect on the current legal relations. Slovakia has also been arguing for decades, in the past 2-3 decades, that the Beneš decrees are only part of the legal history, that they are an obsolete part of the Slovak law, and therefore only a symbolic issue. However, this reasoning turned to be essentially false in 2020, when the practice showed something else. And I would like to talk about 2 cases. On the one hand, the Boski versus Slovakia case, and on the other hand, the attempt to confiscate lots of lands near Bratislava in Pozsony Püspöki. In both cases, the legal basis for the confiscation of the property was that the ancestors of the landowners were Hungarians, and according to the Minister of Justice of Slovakia, Kolíková, these procedures are only the corrections of errors, because those lands which are concerned should have been taken away from the ancestors of the current landowners before 1948. But due to some procedural mistakes, these confiscations have not been completed. And now the state is only correcting those mistakes, taking away lots of lands now on the basis of the Beneš decrees. The specifics about the specifics of the case, the Boski versus Slovakia case, there was a judgment of the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg mid-May last year, where the court specifically found that the Slovak authorities wanted to unlawfully confiscate privately owned lots of lands on the basis of the Beneš decrees. What happened? Mihály Bosi, a Hungarian citizen whose grandparents used to live in the given territory at that time, owned land. He inherited that land from his grandparents as they passed away. But in 2009, the Slovak State Forest Company, claiming that those lands should have been confiscated back in 1946 in accordance with the Beneš decrees, now they want to take those lands and declare them as state property. First, the Slovak courts dismissed this application because they found that, yes, indeed, they wanted to confiscate these plots of lands, the Czechoslovak state, but due to procedural errors, these confiscations were not completed. And then an interesting event happened. The Slovak prosecutor general intervened in the already binding ruling with an extraordinary appeal. It is a very specific option for the prosecutor general in Slovakia to intervene in already binding rulings. And the prosecutor general did so at that time, and that's how the case got to the Supreme Court of Slovakia. And the Supreme Court of Slovakia ruled that the defendants, so the grandparents, so Mr. Bosic's grandparents were of Hungarian ethnicity, and the given property should have been confiscated, but it was some due to procedural reasons failed. And according to the Supreme Court, in order to preserve the necessary authority of the state, it should have been treated as if the property had been confiscated. Basically, this part, they filed this application to Strasbourg based on the alleged violation of the right to fair trial, and that was the subject matter of the case. Because after the Supreme Court's decision, the case was remitted back to the first instance court. So basically, the confiscation was not completed. But according to János Fiala-Butra, who was the legal representative of the plaintiff, he's on the view that the Supreme Court gave so specific ruling that it basically ordered the first instance court to confiscate the property. So the Strasbourg court case was on the violation of the right of the fair trial, as this extraordinary appeal of the prosecutor general was too broad. And the Strasbourg court found that it is too broad and it's violated the right of fair trial of the applicant. But besides that, the European Court of Human Rights stated that Slovak authorities indeed wanted to confiscate these plots of lands. And this was the point from our perspective, that the international court finally pointed out that these confiscations are still ongoing and the retroactive application of the Beneš decrees is still ongoing in Slovakia. And there was another case just one month after, in July 2020, when the Hungarian daily newspaper, the UISO, revealed a case that the Slovak land fund wanted to confiscate 60 plots of land near the construction area of the E4 highway near Bratislava, worth of millions of euros. And again, on the basis of the Beneš decrees that the ancestors of the current landowners were of Hungarian or German nationality, ethnicity. This procedure was stopped because there was a huge political scandal coming from that, but it clearly showed that the Slovak authorities do have the chance to retroactively apply the Beneš decrees in their everyday life procedures, and they are also willing to do that. So here comes the question that how is this possible at all that this messy situation is coming up? Well, the Slovak government's standpoint was that these are historical documents with no legal relevances. And as I said, formally this was true, yet it is not. The decrees have indeed been repealed, yet they do continue to have legal effect on the current legal relations as it is shown. According to János Fiala, the key to understanding this phenomenon is called the disorder in property titles. Because what happened is that under this 104 decision of the Slovak National Council, every German and the Hungarian person of these ethnic origins basically lost their private properties. But this political decision basically was implemented with individual decisions. The authorities individually examined who was German or Hungarian origin and issued an individual confiscation order on that particular person, which was entered into the land registry. This was a theory, but in practice what happened that between 1945 and 1948, there have been several number of erroneous decisions, so mistaken decisions. There is a significant number of persons from whom the state confiscated their property in principle, but in practice, this was not done correctly or not carried out at all. So the properties remained in the possession of the original owners. And these messy situations in the land registry and property titles were not put in order even after that. And Slovakia basically in 1993 inherited this messy situation. And this messy situation in the property titles allows the Slovak state authorities to retroactively apply the Beneš decrees. The relevance of the case is historic because this Boski versus Slovakia case was the very first international decision which specifically stated that these confiscations are still ongoing in Slovakia, and it also annuls Slovakia's arguments that the decrees are only of historic relevance. According to the Slovak authorities, it's only about correcting the mistakes. But in practice, they do take away lots of lands now from those owners who are registered in the land registry. The problem with this is that the correction is taking place today under the current human rights standards. That means that these confiscations do constitute severe violation of human rights norms, not to mention the right to private property, the right to non-discrimination, and also the right to human dignity. And besides that, we also have to talk about legal certainty, because under the current rules, you cannot be sure when the state's gonna come after your land, what you inherited from your grandparents who were of Hungarian origin, and you don't even know about that, about the fact that those lands should have been confiscated back in 1946, but it was not completed. So now the state would claim for the ownership of those lands. So it's a huge gap in the legal certainty. You cannot be sure whether you own a land or not. And this analogy might seem wild, but it's similar to the situation of that the state had not repealed the laws of the Nazi era. So we just can imagine that 1942, there was a confiscation decision, which was not implemented, and now the state would enforce retroactively Nazi laws. It's just crazy. And this is exactly the situation what is prevailing now in Slovakia with the Beneš decrees. So one would assume that in light of this, there was a significant international attention paid on the matter, but it wasn't. The EU, the international organizations, and in the United States of America, the government of the United States remained silent. In terms of the EU, specifically in relation to the Czech Republic's accession to the European Union back before 2004, This issue was seriously debated, and that time the experts of the European Union, the experts of the European Parliament, found that well, basically there is nothing to talk about because these decrees have a historical relevance with no legal relevance in these days. Therefore, there was no barrier of the accession of the Czech Republic to the European Union. That's they found. But after 2007, when the National Assembly of Slovakia adopted a resolution on the untouchability of the decrees, the matter have arisen again in the forms of petitions in the European Parliament. And now there are two petitions still ongoing in the European Parliament. Actually, this year, this January, there was a hearing in the Committee of Petitions in the European Parliament where the petty asked the European Commission to investigate further examination of the situation, taking into consideration the most recent legal developments in the case as well. So now we are waiting for those examinations. Generally, the European Commission in the past 2 decades was pretty much reluctant about taking any action in this matter. The European Commission basically adopted the Slovak and Czech reasoning that these are only of historical relevance. We do not do anything with them. And the European Commission said that the past is the past remains in the past, we go forward. The EU goes forward. However, in light of the recent legal practice, one would still assume that it's not standing anymore. And yet, it was this July when the European Commission again refused to take any actions in this matter, referring to the lack of its own competence. So in EU front, there is still lots of unimprovement. And there, the decrees were generally unaddressed in the United States as well. There have been no single word about the application of the Beneš decrees, or not even after the Strasbourg Court's judgment that Slovak authorities are still applying these decrees in the annual human rights report issued by the State Department of the United States regarding Slovakia. I checked back these annual reports back to 2010, and there's no word about that, not even in the 2020 report. And my personal experiences from the past 8 months are not in contradiction with that. So in the past 8 months, while I'm here in the United States and investigating the human rights advocacy project, I made several interviews. I talked to human rights organizations, the Human Rights Watch, the Human Rights First. I talked to the Atlantic Council, the US Helsinki Commission. I talked to staffers of congressmen and congresswomen. I talked to officials of the State Department, to experts of the Central European Union, Central and Eastern Europe region. There was no one who was aware of these ongoing violations. There is no word about that. So given the saliency of the case and the lack of international awareness, I was assuming that there is something lacking, specifically from our side, from the victims. And that is when I tried to investigate the international advocacy options regarding this case. First, we have to talk about Hungary's role as a key state of these ethnic minorities, which represents the interests of ethnic Hungarians living beyond the borders of Hungary. But generally, we have to say that Hungary's role in this advocacy is quite limited. The issue of the Beneš decrees is a very, very sensitive political question, and not just in terms of the bilateral Slovak-Hungarian relationships, but in terms of the Visegrad cooperation. It's a very sensitive issue. For example, back in 2002, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán, at that time speaking before the European Parliament, called for the abolition of these decrees, and there was a huge political scandal coming from the Czech and Slovak partners within the V4 group. So they even told that the V4 group does not have any future if they're going to bring up such sensitive political issues. So there is a very, very limited maneuvering position for Hungary. And therefore, the role of NGOs is crucial in these terms. the role of NGOs in the Hungarian NGOs in Slovakia and the human rights organizations all around the world. And in terms of the Hungarian advocacy in Slovakia, we gotta say that there is some ad hoc activity coming from legal experts of Hungary from Slovakia, but there is no permanent and strategically organized advocacy. So we gotta improve that. On the other hand, the international organizations generally are not aware of the problem. And since there is a huge lack of international publicity regarding this matter, they're not even interested that much to deal with that. So the core of the problem is in the lack of publicity. What Slovakia says now that the decrees generally cannot be abolished for two reasons. On the one hand, they are the basis of many legal relations and acts up to now. And the other reason coming from them is that opening the matter would undermine the settlement of World War after World War II. This is, however, generally false. Firstly, when we talk about, as I said in the beginning, talk about these Beneš decrees, primarily we mean these decrees on the basis of the principle of collective guilt. And they are not even supposed to have any legal effect today. So the abolishment would only, opening the question would only affect ownership relations, but not the constitutional fundamentals of the state. Secondly, the decrees, or at least the confiscation of property, private property of Hungarian people, was definitely not part of their settlement of the after World War II. So it is again a false reasoning. And thirdly, ordinary Hungarians living in Czechoslovakia had generally no personal responsibility for the disintegration of the country at that time. No one asked them whether they want to be Hungarian citizens when the border changed. However, in accordance and due to the fact that they gained Hungarian citizenship, they were deprived of their Czechoslovak citizenship and deported accordingly. So, and finally, as I said, as a matter of a bigger picture, these decrees were rather an excuse for the Czechoslovak leadership to create this clean Slavic nation state, and none of these reasons would stand today, even though the confiscation of properties are ongoing today, after these days. And on the top of that, there is also reason to believe that the current situation is financially beneficial for Slovakia. On the one hand, they are still gaining or trying to gain the ownership of plots of lands, like in the case of Pozsony Püspöki, 60 plots of lands, like worth millions of euros. So it's much cheaper to confiscate them instead of buying them. And generally, which is the bigger case, the possible restitution might cause an unbearable financial burden on the state. Therefore, Slovakia now is like putting its head to the sand, which is beneficial for the state, but it cannot be a way in the 21st century just to leave it like that. So therefore, we have to put forward some recommendations, and this is my last slide. What can be done? This is obviously a tough one from a legal point of view. There is a must, though, that we must make sure that the confiscation of properties is not ongoing. So the confiscation decrees cannot be applied in the future, but the have-to-do part is not that easy. According to Fia Butora, the only effective solution would be the abolition of the confiscation decrees. This would mean that these decrees can no longer be applied, of course, but on the other hand, that would also mean that the confiscation already completed by that time would be annulled, which would result a individual compensation of those individuals who were deprived of their private property. And there is a real obstacle to that nobody knows exactly how much land is affected with this situation. And since nobody knows how much money we talk about. So first and foremost, this should be found out that how many plots of lands are affected with this messy land property situation, because without knowing the figures, the political decision cannot be made, obviously. But there are several other options for the state as well. Individual compensation for the confiscated property, as I said. The community could be compensated as well for the assets of these cultural organizations which have been basically cancelled, and the property of these associations were confiscated. So somehow the community could be compensated in forms of cultural funds to support Hungarian culture in Slovakia. That could be an idea. And probably there could be a symbolic amount of individual compensation for those who deported. Unfortunately, most of them passed away by now. For example, both of my grandpas have been deported together with their families. None of them are alive still. So by now, so it would be rather a symbolic gesture. And another symbolic gesture would be on behalf of the state to finally apologize for this situation. What the Czech Republic, as far as I know, they did. From the Slovak side, it is still missing the official apology for that. And the Slovak state never explicitly said, unfortunately, that the earlier prevailing concept, namely that the very existence of ethnic minorities in Slovakia is a threat to the country, that was never overcome. So how I see is that the biggest goal would be overcoming the spirit of the decrees, and finally try to make moves to foster equality between the majority Slovaks and minority Hungarians, because nowadays it is obviously not the case in Slovakia, unfortunately. So there's a plenty versions of what we could do. It's a matter of politics as well, whether we can do that or not. Thank you very much.
No questions, please. Questions, comments?
Sure. Yeah, I have a few questions. First of all, thanks very much. It's really fascinating. I was reminded you were mentioning the events prior to accession, and I went back and looked at the legal opinion, which as you referred to, it finds almost nothing that seems to be violative of the law. It's fascinating to note that one of the authors mentions that, well, if the property confiscation provisions were to be applied today, that would clearly violate, and this sounds very much like that. So it's really a fascinating case. I did have a few questions. I could just mention them and take them however you want. One, you said once or twice that the decrees have been repealed, but right here at the end you're mentioning that they need to be abolished. But when did this in fact happen? And when, is my understanding, at least in the Czech case, that was part of the sort of acrobatic argument. They were never repealed. They were interpreted to be moribund, right, non-active. So was that the case in Slovakia, that they were formally repealed at any point? And if so, what is the 2007 resolution all about?
Yeah, on the first one, as I said, in 1948, they decided to stop this area persecution. And that is the point when they formally were stopped. So it is a general understanding that that was the one act, and even through the decades when the democratic transition happened, generally these democratic rules, the basic treaty, the fundamental law overruled these again, if something remained from that. So there's a general understanding that it was a long process. There was generally, definitely a point when in 48 they formally had to do something with that. But there's a general understanding that there should have been there should be no legal consequences.
So they're inapplicable, but they were never formally repealed. Is that right? I mean, there's no act that says these are no longer actually part of our law. They're just no longer being applied. And that's why I'm saying.
I think actually you're right, because that was a political decision that these persecutions going to stop. And what the reasoning is about that this democratic transition naturally overruled these decrees. So that is how they say that under these fundamental standards they should not be. So these fundamental principles in the basic law overruled them, but yet not. And in the other question, the 2007 resolution was like the direct consequence of there was a debate generated in 2007 about the decrees, and at that time the Jan Slota, Vladimir Mečiar, and Robert Fico were governing. That was that quite chauvinistic government, at least towards us in 2007. And the Slovak National Party initiated this resolution. Basically, this is a political act that declares that the decrees are untouchable. Do not even talk about abolishing them, not even the decrees on the basis of the collective guilt. And that is how it was rising again. And these two petitions coming from Hungarians from South Slovakia, they filed these petitions, and this is how actually it's still on the agenda of the European Union. And you were correct about that legal opinion that it should be a different case now, because now that we have proofs that it's not just a historic document. And still, the European Commission is approaching this from a political perspective. This happened July this year when member of the parliament, Laura Fince, filed a question to the European Commission, written question, which required a written answer. And he asked, how is it possible that they are still applying these decrees? And that is how the European Commission answered that there is no international element in this case. However, it's not true, because as you see, Mr. Boski is now a Hungarian citizen. So Hungarian citizen is like, and the ownership right of lands, which is definitely a capital and under the free movement of capital. There is definitely an international case as Hungarian citizen is concerned. So the reasoning of the European Commission is lacking some seriousness, both from a legal and a political point of view, in my view.
I wonder if you could talk maybe a little bit about to what extent there has emerged in the more recent past any sort of dialogue between Hungarian and Slovak lawyers, legal scholars. Is there any sort of movement toward a kind of consensus to an understanding, or is there a continuing standoff?
As to my knowledge, there were some ideas that they're going to be put together an expert organ consisting of Slovak and Hungarian lawyers, which was supposed to be set up, and the general aim of this to be committee would be to investigate the situation on a legal basis. But as to my knowledge, it was not realized. So mostly this situation is debated among historians, which is fair, but now we should speak legal and obviously politics. And from a political perspective, the position of Slovakia is quite tricky. For example, this August, the speaker of the Hungarian parliament was in Slovakia unveiling a memorial of this deportation, and he was giving a speech. And after that, the Slovak political leadership was outraged that it's against the friendship of Slovakia and Hungary even to talk about these cases, because, as they said, these facts hurt them, and this is a trauma for them that happened to them. I mean, the Second World War as a trauma, and this trauma resulted in the decree. So this political reasoning is quite tricky, and it's always requires some political movement on the ground there. And we also have to add that in the past 20 years, even the Hungarian politicians in Slovakia seem to be adopting the Slovak reason, that the decrees are only historical acts, and they were not putting this agenda on their political program. Now, actually, this Sunday is going to be the formal first sitting of the newly united Hungarian party, and that Hungarian party was indicating to address the matter of the decrees in their political program, because so far, it was accepted even from Hungarian politicians in Slovakia that is the past. So that's a huge lack there, because if you do not make movements on the ground from a political perspective, can we wait for the international organizations' help? We cannot. If we ourselves do not realize that what is going on and what is the legal situation, at least there, and how what kind of political steps should be made accordingly.
Yeah, I have two questions for you actually. So the term selective guilt, does that appear in policy? Or is that just a term on which the decrees are based, like an ideology upon which the decrees are based, or is that term in the decrees themselves? And my second question is, what is on that land, the Boski's land, that the Slovakian government wants to give back? Because, for instance, the United States government also can actually take land after offering to kind of settle with a citizen if it has to do with national security, like matters of national security, for instance. So I would assume that maybe that's why the U.S. hasn't said anything about it, just because of what exists in U.S. policy.
The term collective guilt is rather a political term. Even the Slovak historians and the jurists claim that we should not talk about collective guilt because it's rather collective responsibility. Mm-hmm. So it should rather be called actually collective responsibility, but on the other hand, these people were punished accordingly. So I think the term collective guilt, it's a political term, is fair. As to the other question, that is the forest Michal Bošič owns. His grandparents owned that forest, and he inherited that forest in 2006. And after that, in 2009, the state found out that it should be ours. So they found out from the documentation that there was an issued confiscation order towards their grandparents, and it was registered in the land registry, but it was not completed. The confiscation was not completed, and the land remained at Mr. Bošič's grandparents' possession. And they lived their life as they did, so they were not even aware of the fact that they are in threat. So at one point, the states realized that it should be a state property. And that's how this whole case emerged. As to my understanding, there is no specific asset there at that land. As far as I know, it's just an ordinary forest.
I have a couple other questions. One about the scope of the potential effects, and then about the case in Strasbourg. So it wasn't clear to me. You just mentioned that this was a case where the confiscation was not completed, or procedurally initiated. How many people would be potentially affected if we were to follow the Slovak Supreme Court's reasoning? You mentioned that sort of something like a good half of the Hungarians did not apply for re-Slovakization. They were potentially confiscatable through 48. Does this apply to any of them, or only to some small subset of people for whom the property was actually, confiscation was initiated procedurally?
The later one. So the general rule was under this 104 decision that any Hungarian and German could be deprived of their property. And as far as I know, like in terms of the German population, it was like almost complete. But in terms of the Hungarian community, it was not that easy because, as I said, in 48 it was stopped. And what they did is that they were finding out who is Hungarian. And sometimes it was not obvious. And sometimes they just went there and talked to other people. Is that guy Hungarian? Okay, he's Hungarian. So that's how they related. And it concerns only those lands in terms of which these individual confiscation order was issued after individual investigating whether the particular person is Hungarian or German or not.
Do you have a sense of how many? I mean, so I understand that the underlying legal and, shall we say, political questions are the same, whether it's one case or many tens of thousands. Do you have any sense of how many cases reach that stage such that they would be subject to this?
That is a problem that we do not know that. That is the biggest problem. that it's the land registry and the property titles are so chaotic in Slovakia, which, as I said, it was chaotic in 45, 48, and this was inherited during the communism. Nobody wanted to deal with that, and Slovakia now doesn't want to deal with that because it's not beneficial for the state. So now we do not know that. So that would be the very first step to do that somehow to find out, set up a committee made of experts and look through all these ownership rights, because what I think is that there's a fear that they do not know how much land is affected with that. So I think it's for them it's not even better just to get away with that. But obviously this is the biggest question, and as I said, from a legal certainty point of view, it's terrible that you cannot know that when your land's going to be there.
If I could have, I don't know if we have time or whether you have a question. I did have one other question, but I did.
We have some questions on Zoom.
Oh, go ahead, do that. That's what.
Okay. So Ian Quinn asks, are there any state-owned assets like power stations, water pumps, etc., that have been built on the land that we know of?
I'm not aware of that. This state that said came up in this Pozsony case where the highway was built there, and when they made the paperwork, then they realized that these plots of lands are affected. But otherwise, I think it only comes up when these infrastructural buildings are built there, and when they are making the paperwork, that then they realize that what is the case with that particular land. So I'm not aware of that any where is there built some infrastructural or strategical building and that the land is affected. I assume there is no, but I cannot be sure about that.
And Howard Matson has a question he would like to ask, so I'm just going to unmute him. You're there, Howard?
I'm here. Doctor, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very, very much for a fascinating lecture. I have 3 quick questions. The first one had to do with the map that you had up, and it stated on there 5% Hungarian.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, since obviously this area was a province under the domination of Budapest, Hungary, at least since the beginning of the dual monarchy. And this sort of reminds me of like on July 4th, 1776, everyone in the United States was British. And then the next day, everyone was a colonist for America, and only 5% were British. My question is, was there that strong a sense of nationalism from the Czech and Slovak people that a map like this shows 5% Hungarian?
As far as I know, that after the World War I, when the newly created border appeared, there were somewhat around 1 million Hungarians who found themselves on the other side of the border. But when they realized that the Czechs are coming, the Czech army is coming, and the Czech authorities coming, and specifically right before the Treaty of Trianon, many of them moved to Hungary. So that's how this 5% was created. As I told, like 350,000 of them re-Slovakized. But after the fear disappeared that when you say that you're Hungarian and due to that you're going to lose your property, many of them came back, reclaimed their Hungarian ethnicity. And now, according to the 2011 census, there are 450,000 Hungarians living in Slovakia.
And my second question is, you mentioned the Slovak National Council during World War II. Was this something that was subservient to the council in Prague, or was this sort of a quasi-shadow government?
The Slovak National Council became relevant after the declaring of the government program in Košice on April 4th, 1945, because at that time the eastern part of the country was already liberated or occupied by the Red Army, and the western parts not. So at that time, the Slovak National Council also adopted these decisions, but these concerned only the territory of Slovakia.
And my last question is about the ethnic cleansing, about Hungarians being expelled, the Germans being expelled. Was any of this directed towards the Jewish population specifically?
Unfortunately, the Jewish population was taken care of during the Slovak, at least in terms of Slovakia, the first Slovak Republic under the leadership of Josef Tiso, which was a client state of the Nazi Germany. Tiso wanted to be one of the best pupils of Hitler, so he was trying to eliminate as many Jews, unfortunately, as he could. So in terms of, for example, in the southern parts, where was like a huge Jewish population during the war, and even in the northern parts of Slovakia, these Jews, unfortunately, were deported during the Second World War, and it was not an issue after the war.
Professor, thank you very much. Again, very fascinating.
Thank you very much for your questions.
All right, and we have one more question, but if we're out of time.
Yes, please.
So Michael Goodman asks, are there still any issues with property owned by Germans? Does the Munich-based Landsmannschaft or Studenten Germans play any role in protecting German interests in the former Sudetenland?
As I said today, only 0.2% of the Czech Republic's population is German. There have been several cases in front of the Czech Constitutional Court in the 90s and the early millennial years, and of course in front of the European Court of Human Rights as well. But these were not real programs from a legal perspective, and from a political one, there have been some political clashes between the German leadership and the Czech leadership, mainly in course of the Czech Republic's EU accession. But these were not so tense as the Hungarian Slovak political debates about the matter were. So what my understanding is that they were rather resettled, and now they do not make a tense political situation nowadays, not like the Slovak Hungarian.
That's it from Zoom.
So I would like let me just come here for a moment. Just to refer to two issues as a historian. Mr. Madsen had a question about Jewish Hungarians, and there were Jewish Hungarians left in Slovakia in 1945 because a smaller percentage of Slovak Jews were never deported. Tiso recanted and he stopped deportations in 1942, but the new Czechoslovak authorities made no distinction whatsoever between Hungarian Jews and other Hungarians. So the lands of Hungarian Jews were confiscated, and some of them were actually resettled in Hungary. And what is very interesting, though, and was not mentioned, is that there's a much bigger issue between Poland and Germany regarding reclaiming land that were Germanized, colonized in Poland. So that's a huge issue, and much bigger than this one, much bigger international political ramifications. So that's something that might bother the Slovak government. But in Hoax Signal, I want to thank our speaker for a fantastic presentation and our participants for paying attention and for their very, very good questions. Thank you very much. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye. To look up, return the key to the black box. You got the key. Very good. Okay. I was warned that we have to do that.
I need to, so.
spirit.